and an elderly mother visited her wealthy son, but when she opened the door she discovered something that froze her in place. The dawn had just begun to cast light over the fields when Margaret woke up as she had done all her life. Her small home in the countryside, with furniture worn by time, was enveloped in the same silence as always, a silence that had grown heavier over the years. The morning cold seeped through the walls, but that didn't bother her. Margaret had something more urgent weighing on her mind: her son John. She had grown used to the long sleepless nights. Thinking of him, time seemed to have stopped since the last time she received a call or a letter from him. 2 years had passed since his last visit, and although she initially excused his absence by blaming the relentless pace of life in the city, doubts began to ignore at her. The neighbors constantly asked, "How is your son, Mrs. Margaret? When will he come visit you?" Margaret always smiled and said that John was very busy, but deep down the anxiety grew like a shadow as she dressed in her best clothes, a brown wool skirt and a blouse she had saved for special occasions. Margaret made a decision she had been avoiding. She couldn't wait any longer. The nights were too long and the silence too painful. If John wasn't going to come to her, she would find him. She had raised her son with her own hands, working from dawn to dusk in the fields. After her husband's death, he was everything to her. She couldn't let him go without at least knowing the truth was he was okay. Had he found something that kept him away from his mother? Or was there something darker behind his disappearance? With a small suitcase in hand, Margaret left her home, closing the door with a lump in her throat. The journey to the city wasn't long in terms of distance, but the emotional weight made it seem endless. She boarded the old bus that would take her to her destination, sitting in a corner as she watched the countryside fade away. Through the window, she remembered the time she had waved goodbye to John when he left for the city, full of dreams and promises. He had promised to return, promised that his success would also be hers. But now, after so many years of silence, those memories filled her with overwhelming sadness. As the hours passed, the landscape changed. The vast plains of the countryside turned into towering grey buildings that seemed to challenge the sky. The city was noisy, bustling, and for Margaret completely unfamiliar. The lights from the cars, the relentless noise of traffic, the rush of people, everything made her feel small, as if she were in a place where she didn't belong. But there was no turning back. John was here, and she had to find him. Upon arriving at the bus station, Margaret felt overwhelmed by the number of people coming and going without even noticing her difficulty. She found the crumpled piece of paper with the address of John's mansion. She had kept it in her bag since the last time he wrote to her. The address was in one of the city's most exclusive areas, a place she had never imagined visiting. She took a taxi, and as the car drove through the luxurious streets, Margaret gazed in awe at the enormous buildings and mansions. Passing by, she had never seen houses so large, so perfect. They were cold, spotless, and seemed devoid of life. She remembered John's promise one day: "I'll bring you to live with me to the city where everything is easier and more comfortable." But Margaret had never wished to leave her life in the countryside. All she ever wanted was for her son to be happy, even if that meant being far from her. Finally, the taxi stopped in front of an imposing mansion. The wrought iron gates and perfectly manicured garden intimidated her. With trembling hands, she paid the driver and stepped out of the car. Standing before the door, she felt the weight of the luxury surrounding her, as if the place itself was judging her. She took a deep breath and gathered her courage. Ringing the bell, several minutes passed, though they felt like an eternity to Margaret. Finally, the door slowly opened, revealing a young woman dressed elegantly. Her beauty was cold, and her eyes upon meeting Margaret's filled with a mixture of surprise and disdain. "Yes?" the woman asked, not bothering to hide her contempt. "I'm Margaret, John's mother," she replied, her voice trembling. The woman's face showed no emotion, no smile, no welcoming gesture. "John isn't home," she said curtly. "He's very busy with his business." Margaret's disappointment and unease intensified, but she didn't let herself be intimidated. She had come from far away, traveling with a broken heart to see her son, and she wouldn't leave so easily. "I've come from the countryside to see him. I can wait until he returns," she said with a calm that didn't reflect the emotional turmoil she felt inside. Catherine, as the woman introduced herself, looked at her with a mix of irritation and disdain. After a few moments of uncomfortable silence, she finally relented and allowed Margaret to enter, leading her to a small room near the entrance. The contrast between the mansion's opulence and Margaret's humility was stark, but she didn't let it faze her. All she wanted was to know where her son was and why he hadn't told her anything about his new life, especially his marriage. The wait would be long, but at that moment Margaret was willing to do anything to reunite with JN. The silence in the house, however, was unsettling, and as Margaret settled into a sofa that didn't seem to have ever been used, a dark feeling began to grow. In her chest, something wasn't right. She could feel it. Margaret couldn't stop looking around as she sat in the enormous and luxurious living room of the mansion. The contrast between the old furniture in her home and the cold opulence that surrounded her now was overwhelming. The walls were adorned with expensive paintings, and the velvet curtains fell heavily to the floor as if hiding secrets behind them. However, despite the luxury, something about the place felt empty. As if the house itself lacked life, Margaret shifted uncomfortably on the leather sofa, which creaked under her weight. She couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong there, but her love for John kept her steady. She had traveled so far to see him, and she wouldn't leave without answers. She looked around, searching for signs of her son, a photo, a memento that would confirm that this was his home. But she found nothing, not a single picture of John, no trace of his presence. It was as if the mansion held nothing of him. Several minutes passed before Catherine, John's wife, returned to the room. Her expression remained cold, almost detached, and she carried a cup of tea which she placed in front of Margaret on a low table. "Here to warm you up," she said indifferently. "Thank you, dear," Margaret replied softly, hoping to break the barrier between them. "When do you think John will be back? I'm so eager to see him." Catherine sat on a nearby chair, crossing her legs with an elegance that seemed calculated. Her eyes scanned Margaret's small, tired frame as if evaluating every detail of her humble appearance. "John is very busy these days," Catherine responded. "Business consumes all of his time. Sometimes he doesn't even come home at night. He's always traveling, closing important deals. He's a very sort of man." Margaret nodded slowly, but something about her words didn't sit right with her. This wasn't the John she knew. Her son had always been dedicated, yes, but also loving. He would never have left his mother for so long without a word, much less with the indifference that Catherine was pro-in. Now every word she said seemed to carry a layer of coldness and distance, as if there was something she didn't want to reveal. "When do you think I'll be able to see him?" Margaret pressed her voice firmer than before. "I don't know," Catherine replied, standing up once again. "It could be days, maybe weeks. I'm not sure of his schedule, but if you like, you can stay here until he returns." Catherine didn't wait for a response before turning to leave once again, leaving Margaret alone in that enormous empty room. Margaret watched as her figure disappeared through a door, leaving her with the echo of her own thoughts. Time passed slowly in the mansion. The light that streamed through the windows began to fade as the sun set, casting everything in shades of orange and gold. The seconds felt like hours as Margaret waited for any sign, any news of her son. The tea that Catherine had brought her had long gone cold, but she hadn't touched it. Her stomach was too unsettled to drink or eat anything. Hours later, Margaret began to feel even more uncomfortable. The silence in the mansion was unsettling, almost oppressive. The walls seemed to close in, and every little sound, from the creaking wood to the distant murmur of the staff, echoed. In her mind, she knew something was wrong. Her mother's instinct screamed that there was something hidden behind that coldness, something Catherine wasn't willing to tell her. The house staff passed by from time to time, avoiding looking directly at her. They were like shadows, moving quickly from one room to another, as if they wanted to remain invisible. This only increased the unease in Margaret's heart. No one smiled at her, not even a look of understanding. She felt like a stranger in her own son's life. Finally, as darkness fully enveloped the house, Catherine returned to the room. This time, she offered no explanation or kind words. She simply stood at the entrance looking at Margaret. "It's late, Mrs. Margaret," she said emotionlessly. "I'll ask Alfred, our butler, to take you to a room where you can rest. It may be several days before John returns." Margaret stood up, nodding slowly, though her heart was filled with uncertainty. She wanted to say something, to ask more questions, but she knew Catherine wouldn't give her any answers. Her son's wife had an impenetrable barrier around her. and there was no way to break through it, at least not for now. The butler Alfred appeared at the door. He was an older man, his face marked by experience, and a cautious expression. He motioned for Margaret to follow him through the dark hallways of the mansion in silence. As they walked, Margaret noticed that Alfred avoided making eye contact with her, but there was something in his demeanor that made her think he knew more than he was letting on. They arrived at a small room far from the center of the house. It was no more than a guest room, but for Margaret it was more than enough. She was exhausted both physically and emotionally. She sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the sound of Alfred's footsteps fading away in the hallway. Silence fell over her once again, a silence that weighed heavily on her chest. Before Alfred closed the door, Margaret stopped him with a question that had been on her mind since she arrived. "Excuse me, Alfred, is it?" she asked softly. "Do you know when my son will be back?" Alfred hesitated, as if unsure whether or not he should answer. Finally, he nodded slightly without looking at her. "Your son, John, it's complicated, Mrs. Margaret. He's very busy," he said, and without adding more closed the door. Behind him, Alfred's words echoed in Margaret's mind. Something about the way he spoke left her uneasy. The same empty words that Catherine had repeated, but this time with a tone that hinted at something more. What were they hiding? Lying in the small bed, Margaret tried to close her eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Her son was somewhere, perhaps closer than she thought, but wrapped in a mystery she couldn't understand. What was Catherine hiding, and why did no one seem willing to talk about him directly? As her thoughts wandered, Margaret knew one thing for sure: she wouldn't leave that mansion until she discovered the truth about her son. Something was wrong. She felt it deep in her heart. The first ray of sunlight slipped through the heavy curtains of the room as Margaret opened her eyes after a night filled with restless dreams. Emotional exhaustion weighed on her body, but she knew she couldn't stop now. Even though Catherine insisted that John was away on business, her heart told her otherwise. There was something in that mansion that didn't fit, something everyone around her seemed to be hiding. She rose slowly, feeling the cold floor beneath her bare feet, and dressed in the same clothes she had brought from the countryside. Once ready, she decided to head to the dining room, hoping that perhaps finally Catherine would give her some more concrete news about her son. As she walked through the long hallways, the absolute silence enveloped her. She could barely hear the footsteps of the house staff moving like shadows between the rooms without speaking a single word to her, or even glancing her way. When she reached the dining room, she found the grand table empty. There was no sign of Catherine or any other family members. Only a few servants passed back and forth, setting out a breakfast that seemed more suited for a feast than the loneliness that filled the house. She sat slowly in one of the chairs, uncomfortable with the luxury that surrounded her. But she decided to wait. Minutes, perhaps hours passed, but Catherine didn't appear. The mansion, despite its size, felt empty, and the sense of abandonment grew in Margaret's chest. The servants moved quickly, avoiding her gaze every time they passed nearby. Not a kind word, not even a courteous gesture. It was as if they were afraid she would ask them something, as if Margaret's presence disrupted the cold, controlled routine that Catherine had imposed after finishing breakfast. Without even remembering what she had eaten, Margaret decided to walk through the mansion. Something pushed her to find out what was really going on, to discover any clue that would reveal where John was. She passed several locked rooms, which struck her as odd in such a large house. Every time she tried to approach one of the doors, a servant appeared, almost as if they were watching her, offering an excuse to lead her away from that area. In one of the farthest hallways of the house, near the area that seemed reserved for the staff, Margaret saw Alfred, the butler. He was bent over, cleaning an old table, but when he noticed her presence, he stopped. His eyes, filled with a mixture of concern and caution, lingered on her for a second too long. "Alfred," Margaret called, approaching slowly. The man looked up, and though he seemed uncomfortable, he didn't avoid her like the others. "Mrs. Margaret," he responded in a deep voice. "Where is my son?" she asked, directly, feeling that she could no longer pretend everything was fine. Alfred tensed up, as if that question had put him in a dangerous situation. He glanced around, making sure no one else was listening. Who he started, but then fell silent for a moment, as though struggling with his words. "It's not my place to say." Margaret realized that Alfred knew something important, but for some reason he couldn't reveal it right then. Still, Her intuition told her that he held the key to uncovering what was really going on in that house. "If it's not your place, then whose is it?" Margaret replied, trying to stay calm. "My son is all I have, and something tells me you're not telling me the whole truth." Alfred looked away, clearly troubled by the situation. But before he could say anything more, a sound in the hallway alerted him. Kathleen appeared in the doorway, her cold presence filling the room. "Everything okay here?" she asked with a tense smile, glancing at both Margaret and Alfred, who immediately resumed his work without another word. Margaret felt Catherine's gaze weighing on her, but she said nothing. She knew she had to be cautious for now, nodding slightly. She left the room and returned to the main hall later as the afternoon wore on. Margaret decided to approach Alfred again, knowing that he, her only silent ally, was trapped. In the fear that Catherine inspired in all the stuff, she found him in the kitchen arranging some cutlery. And this time she made sure no one else was nearby. "Alfred, I know you know something. Please tell me the truth." Margaret pleaded quietly, her eyes filled with desperation. The butler looked down, but this time he couldn't avoid responding. "Mrs. Margaret, things in this house aren't what they seem." He whispered, his tone tense. "Your son John isn't traveling, he's here in the house." Margaret felt a blow to her chest. John had been in the house all along. Why had Catherine lied before she could ask more? Alfred continued, lowering his voice even more. "John, he had an accident months ago, a very serious one since then. Catherine hasn't allowed anyone to see him. She keeps him hid. I can't say more, ma'am, but you deserve to know. Just be careful. Catherine isn't who she seems to be." Margaret's heart raced as she tried to process what she had just heard. John was in that mansion, possibly close by, and she hadn't known what kind of accident had he suffered, and why was Catherine keeping him hidden? Before she could ask more questions, Alfred quickly walked away, leaving Margaret alone in the kitchen, burdened by her new suspicions. That night in her small room, Margaret couldn't stop thinking about what she had uncovered. Something terrible was happening in that house, and now she knew it for sure. Catherine had been lying to her from the start. Her son, her beloved John, was there somewhere, and they were keeping him prisoner in some way. The intrigue and fear consumed her. But one thing was clear: she wouldn't leave that mansion until she knew exactly what had happened to her son and why his own wife was keeping him away from the world. Margaret promised herself that she would find the truth no matter the cost. That night, Margaret could barely sleep. The whispers of shadows seemed to echo through the mansion's hallways, mixing with her own thoughts. She knew John was there, so close and yet so far, but he was being hidden, kept in the shadows by Catherine's coldness. Alfred's words echoed in her mind. John is in the house, but why wasn't anyone talking about him? What kind of accident had he suffered that they were keeping him locked away, invisible to the world? The anxiety and fear wouldn't let her stay still. The silence in the mansion was more oppressive than usual, and the feeling that something was wrong gwed at her. From the inside, she got up from the bed, determined to act. She knew Catherine wouldn't tell her anything else, and the few clues she had gotten from Alfred weren't enough. She had to find the truth herself, even if it meant risking the unknown barefoot and moving cautiously. She left her room and walked through the mansion's hallways, which were barely lit by the dim glow of the lamps. Her breathing quickened with every step, and the echo of her feet seemed to resonate in every corner, as though the whole place was watching her. The elongated shadows of the furniture seemed to move around her, and Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. She passed by several closed doors, remembering how in the previous days she had noticed that many of the rooms were completely locked. She stopped in front of one of those doors. It was a large wooden door with a heavy lock. Something inside her told her that behind that door lay part of the truth she was seeking. She tried to turn the knob, but it was locked like so many others. Just as she was about to walk away, she heard a sound, a faint murmur, almost imperceptible, came from the other side of the door. Margaret held her breath and pressed her ear against the wood. She couldn't make out the words, but what she heard was unmistakable. Someone was speaking, and it wasn't a monologue. It sounded like a conversation, fear mixed with curiosity. Who was in there? Could it be John? Margaret took a step back, her heart pounding. She couldn't open the door, but this confirmed her suspicions. Something was happening behind those locked doors. Before she could move, a figure appeared at the end of the hallway. It was Alfred, the butler. Upon seeing her there, he visibly tensed. He walked toward her, his steps silent as if trying not to alert. "Anyone else in the house, Mrs. Margaret?" he whispered. "You can't be here. Kathleen must not find out." Margaret looked at him, her eyes reflecting the urgency of a mother. "Desperate to know the truth, Alfred. Please tell me the truth," she said in a low voice, almost pleading. "My son is here. Isn't he? You can't keep hiding what's going on. Something's wrong, I feel it in my heart." Alfred nervously glanced around the hallway before moving even closer to Margaret. His eyes were filled with worry but also compassion. "You're right, John is here," he whispered gravely. "But not in the way you expect. He had an accident, or at least that's what we're all supposed to believe." Margaret felt a lump form in her throat. "What kind of accident?" she asked, her voice trembling. Alfred swallowed hard, clearly nervous about what he was about to say. "No one knows for sure what happened. They told us that JN had a fall, but the rumors among the staff," he looked around again, ensuring no one was listening, "suggest it wasn't an accident. What's certain is that since then John hasn't been the same. He's bedridden, gravely ill. He's being kept in a room in the farthest wing of the house, one that only Catherine and a select few have access to." Margaret felt the ground beneath her feet disappear. "Why are they hiding him?" she asked, her voice choked with anguish. "I'm not sure," Alfred replied, looking down, "but many of us believe it wasn't a simple accident. Catherine, she's changed a lot since John got sick. She's taken full control of the business, and she barely allows anyone to visit him. Even the nurse who takes care of him is under her strict control. The entire house has become a prison for John." Margaret felt a whirlwind of emotions: pain, anger, fear. John, her son, was being kept a prisoner in his own home under the control of his wife, and no one was doing anything to help him. "I have to see him," Margaret said, clenching her fists. "I have to see my son." Alfred looked at her with sadness. Alfred stiffened as if that question had put him in a dangerous situation. He looked around cautiously, ensuring no one else was listening. "It's not that easy. That Catherine has eyes everywhere. She doesn't allow anyone near John without her permission. But there is someone who might be able to help you." Margaret lifted her gaze, hope flickering in her eyes. "The nurse who cares for John. Her name is Olivia. She's the only one who's seen him since he fell ill. If you can talk to her, you might find out more." Margaret nodded, feeling a spark of hope reignite within her. She now had a name, a possible ally, but she also knew that any wrong move could endanger not just her son's health, but also her own life. Alfred gently took her by the arm and led her to the back of the house, where a small garden lay hidden behind the mansion's tall walls. "You can't go directly," he warned. "You must wait for the right moment. Catherine leaves the house at certain times to attend to business. When she's gone, I'll find a way for you to speak with Olivia. But please, Mrs. Margaret, be careful. None of us are safe." Here Margaret nodded with determination. The cool night air in the garden brushed her face, giving her a moment of clarity. She knew the puzzle pieces were beginning to fall into place, but facing Catherine would be a challenge fraught with danger. Back in her room, Margaret collapsed onto the bed, her mind racing. JN was somewhere in that mansion, and she wouldn't stop until she freed him. But now she knew she wasn't alone in this fight. Olivia and Alfred were the keys to uncovering the truth and rescuing her son from the grip of a house that, despite its luxurious exterior, hid dark secrets within. The night felt long, but this time Margaret didn't feel the same emptiness. She knew what she had to do, and nothing and no one would stop her. The sun was beginning to rise when Margaret awoke, her thoughts still clouded by what she had learned the night before. She knew the situation in the mansion was far darker than Sini had let on, and that her son was caught in a plot she didn't yet fully understand. But Catherine's cold, calculating demeanor and Alfred's fearful tone made it clear that nothing happening in that house was an accident. She was waiting for the right moment. As Alfred had promised, Catherine left the mansion early to attend to some business matters. Margaret felt that this was the moment she had been waiting for. Her heart pounded as she made her way through the halls, heading to the area where Alfred had told her she would find Olivia, the young nurse who cared for John. Finally, she arrived at a discreet door almost hidden. At the end of a long corridor, she took a deep breath before knocking gently, her hand trembling with the tension that had been building inside her. After a few seconds, which felt like an eternity, the door opened, revealing a young woman with a tired but kind face. It was Olivia. "Are you JK's mother?" Olivia asked in a whisper, as if she already knew who. Margaret was though they had never met. Margaret nodded, her throat tight with emotion. I need to know the truth about my son, she said, her voice trembling but firm. Please tell me what's really going on, what has happened to him. Olivia glanced nervously around, ensuring no one was listening. Then, with a quick gesture, she motioned for Margaret to come inside. Once inside, Olivia closed the door carefully and turned to face her, her eyes filled with concern. Miss Margaret, there's much I shouldn't tell you, but you have the right to know, Olivia began, her voice barely audible. Your son, he's gravely ill, and not just because of the accident Catherine mentions. I can't prove it, but I suspect that John has been slowly poisoned. The world stopped for Margaret. At that moment, Olivia's words hit her like a hard blow to the chest. Poisoned? Margaret whispered, unable to comprehend. How is that possible? Who could do such a thing? Olivia took a deep breath before continuing. Catherine, she controls everything that happens in this house. And since John's accident, no one has had direct access to his care except for me and a few people. She trusts the symptoms your son is showing don't match. Her fall, the weakness, the vomiting, the loss of mobility all point to him consuming something that's been weakening him slowly. I don't have concrete proof, but every time he shows signs of improvement, he suddenly gets worse. After one of Catherine's visits, Margaret felt a cold rage building inside her. How could Catherine do something so monstrous? Her son, her beloved John, was being destroyed from within by the person he trusted most. It can't be, Margaret said, fighting back tears. Why would she do that? What would she gain from hurting him? Olivia looked at her with sadness. Control. Since John fell ill, Catherine has taken control of all his businesses. She's made suspicious financial moves, and her brother William is involved as well. It all points to them slowly draining John's account, seizing his assets. If JN dies, Catherine would inherit everything. Olivia's words hit Margaret hard. Everything was beginning to make sense. Catherine's coldness, the silence in the house, the evasive glances from the staff, it was all part of a plot, a meticulously calculated plan to take everything John had built. And meanwhile, her son lay in a bed wasting away. We have to do something. We have to get him out of here, Margaret said, her voice filled with desperation. Olivia nodded. I know, but it won't be easy. Catherine controls everything. Every medication JN receives goes through her first, and she has the doctors under her command. I've tried to change the treatment, but every time I do, Catherine finds out. I don't know how much longer I can keep helping him without her. Realizing, Margaret felt a lump in her throat. The fear for her son's life was greater than ever, but she knew they couldn't just sit back. They had to come up with a plan, and quickly. But they needed evidence, something they could take to the authorities to expose what Catherine was doing. Without proof, it would all be in vain. Is there any way to get proof of what they're doing to him? Margaret asked, her gaze fixed on Olivia. The young nurse nodded, though cautiously. I've been collecting samples of the medication Catherine gives John, and I think I can get a trusted doctor to analyze them, but I'll need time, and it'll be risky if Catherine finds out what we're doing. It could make things worse for John. Margaret knew time wasn't on their side, but she also understood that without proof they had no chance. Catherine and William were dangerous, and any mistake could put not only John's life at risk, but also Olivia's and her own. You have to do it, Olivia. It's our only option, Margaret said, gripping the young nurse's hands with desperate urgency. Please, we have to save my son. Olivia nodded, determination in her eyes. I'll do it, but you need to be careful too. Catherine isn't stupid. If she suspects we're up to something, she won't hesitate to act. What we're doing is extremely dangerous. Margaret knew that. The danger hung over her like a constant shadow, but the love she felt for her son was stronger than any fear. No matter what she had to do, no matter the risk, she wouldn't rest until John was safe. As Olivia began collecting the samples and preparing her plan to have them analyzed, Margaret was left alone in the small room. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of emotions. On one hand, she felt fear of what Catherine was capable of doing, but on the other hand, a growing fury and determination kept her on her feet. She knew the fight ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to face it. As she stepped out of the room, Alfred appeared in the hallway. His eyes, though tired, showed a hint of relief upon seeing her. Did you find out? He asked in a low voice. Margaret nodded. John is being poisoned. Catherine is killing him. Slowly, Alfred closed his eyes for a moment. as if what Margaret had just revealed confirmed all his suspicions. Then he looked at her with determination. "I'll help you in any way necessary. We can't let Catherine get away with this." Margaret nodded. She knew that now more than ever she would need allies, and Alfred and Olivia would be her pillars in this fight. Time was running against her, but now she had a plan, and most importantly, hope. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in deep red hues, Margaret felt that the battle for her son's life had just begun, and she was ready to face Catherine no matter the cost. The days passed slowly in the mansion, each one filled with a tense silence. Margaret felt the weight of uncertainty crushing her more and more as she awaited the moment when Olivia could obtain proof of John's poisoning. She couldn't afford a single mistake or act impulsively. The threat posed by Catherine and William was far greater than she had imagined. During the day, Margaret spent most of her time walking through the mansion's halls, carefully observing the movements of the staff, and Catherine, however, her son's wife, seemed busier than ever, constantly on the phone and leaving the house to attend to business matters. Although she maintained a facade of control and elegance, Margaret could sense the coldness and disdain whenever Catherine crossed her room without even glancing her way. Meanwhile, Alfred remained her only ally among the stars. The butler kept her informed about Catherine and William's movements, while Olivia did everything in her power to keep JN stable and gather samples of the altered medications. Margaret knew that evidence alone wouldn't be enough to save her son. They also needed to unearth Catherine's past, something that could completely expose her. One afternoon, as the grey sky threatened rain, Margaret decided to investigate on her own. She knew there had to be more clues somewhere in that mansion about who Catherine really was and what dark plans she was hiding. Alfred had warned her about Catherine and William's offices located in one of the house's far wings. These were 2 rooms that were always locked, but in an act of loyalty and desperation, Alfred had given her a copy of the keys. With her heart racing, Margaret approached Catherine's office door. The mansion was unusually quiet, and she knew Catherine and William had left to attend an important meeting in the city. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The key turned in the lock with a soft click, and Margaret gently pushed the door open. The office was a perfect reflection of Catherine's personality, impeccably organized, cold, and devoid of any warmth. The dark mahogany furniture and expensive paintings on the walls spoke of power and control. Margaret walked toward the desk, where several documents were neatly stacked. She knew she had to act quickly, but also cautiously. With trembling hands, she rifled through the papers, searching for anything that could give her a clue about Catherine's dark secrets, business contracts, financial agreements. Everything seemed in order, but then in the bottom of a drawer she found something that made her stop in her tracks. It was a personal file with Catherine's name embossed in gold. Letters. She opened it with nervous hands. The file contained a series of letters and documents that revealed a past Catherine had meticulously hidden. The letters were correspondence from her 2 previous marriages, and as Margaret read, a clear picture began to form in her mind. Catherine had been the widow of 2 wealthy men before marrying John. Both marriages had ended in tragedy. Both men had died under suspicious circumstances shortly after signing documents naming her the sole heir to their fortunes. One of the oldest letters, written by the brother of one of the deceased, described how he had tried to investigate his brother's death, but all his attempts were thwarted by Catherine, who had ensured that the media and anyone trying to question the accidental death were silenced. Margaret felt a wave of disgust and horror wash over her as she realized that Catherine had been repeating this cycle, marrying wealthy men, manipulating them, and getting rid of them to inherit their fortunes. John, her beloved son, was next on that long list of betrayals and deaths. Margaret clenched her fists, her rage and pain threatening to overwhelm her. But she knew she couldn't give in to those emotions. She had to stay strong, focused. This information was crucial, but it wouldn't be enough to condemn Catherine without the proof of poisoning. However, with this file at least she could expose Catherine's true character to the authorities. Quickly, she stashed the file in her bag and left the office. There was still William's office, and Margaret was convinced that more evidence of the financial conspiracy between the siblings lay hidden there. With the same caution, she made her way to William's office, unlocking the door. With the key Alfred had given her, the inside was much more chaotic than Catherine's, with piles of papers and legal books scattered everywhere. Unlike Catherine's meticulous order, William seemed to thrive in controlled chaos. Margaret began sifting through the folders and documents on the desk, looking for anything that could incriminate William and his sister. What she found sent a chill down her spine. Contract signed by John ceding control of his businesses to Catherine. The signatures were recent, but Margaret knew that John had been too ill to even hold a pen in recent weeks. This could only mean one thing: the signatures had been forged. Additionally, she found several records of money transfers to unknown accounts, all linked to Catherine and William. The money John had worked so hard to earn was disappearing, being drained in a carefully calculated plan to bankrupt him and leave Catherine as the sole heir to whatever remained. The evidence was right there in front of her. Catherine and William had been manipulating John's businesses since he fell ill. Not only did they want his life, but they also wanted to destroy his legacy, his hard work, everything he had built. Margaret quickly took some photos of the documents with her phone, knowing she had to move fast before anyone found her. She tucked the evidence into her bag and left the office. Her heart pounding, she now had everything she needed. Catherine's dark past, the forged contracts, and the financial records proving the betrayal. All that was missing were the poisoning proofs. She returned to her room, feeling that she had finally taken a crucial step towards saving her son. But the weight of what she had discovered also crushed her. How could someone be so cruel? How could Catherine, the woman who had promised to love and care for John, be behind such a monstrous plot? The next day, Margaret met with Olivia in secret. The nurse handed her the samples of the medications she had collected over the past few days. Margaret carefully stored them, knowing that a trusted doctor would analyze them if her suspicions were confirmed and the medications were indeed tampered with. They would have the definitive proof to take to the authorities. "How long do you think it will take to get the results, Margaret?" asked anxious Olivia. Sighed, clearly exhausted from the tension of the past few days. "I hope we'll have the results in a couple of days, but we must be careful. Catherine is starting to get suspicious. If she realizes what we're planning, she might act before we get the evidence." Margaret nodded, feeling that time was her greatest enemy each day that passed. John's life hung by a thread, but she also knew they couldn't rush things. The only way to defeat Catherine was to be as meticulous as she had been. In her plan to destroy JN, Olivia promised to keep John as stable as possible, though it was becoming harder. Each day the situation grew more desperate with each passing moment. But both women knew they couldn't give up. That night, Margaret returned to her room, overwhelmed by the weight of the evidence she had collected and the fear that Catherine might discover their plans. She knew a confrontation was inevitable, and when that moment came, she would need all the courage and strength she had left to face someone as dangerous and calculating as Catherine. She stared out the window where the city lights flickered in the distance. She wondered how many other lives Catherine had destroyed with her insatiable ambition. But one thing was clear to Margaret: her son would not be the next victim. With renewed determination, Margaret prepared herself mentally for the next steps. Days passed slowly in the mansion, and each hour felt like time slipping away. Margaret knew the situation was becoming more critical. With every day, John remained under Catherine and William's control. However, she now had an advantage. The evidence was coming, and John poisoning would soon be exposed. But something else worried her deeply. Even with the proof, John was still a prisoner in his own home. Catherine had barely left the mansion in the past few days, complicating any attempts to get close to John. Her movements were cold and soon gave her the opportunity she had been waiting for. One morning, Alfred informed her that Catherine and William had an important meeting out of town and would be gone for most of the day. This was the moment Margaret, Olivia, and Alfred had been waiting for. The escape plan had to be executed now. While Catherine and William were away, any delay could be fatal. They knew they couldn't simply walk John out of the mansion without someone stopping them, so they had devised a meticulous plan. At dawn, Catherine and William left the house. The butler, always efficient and discreet, confirmed that the guards at the entrance and the security cameras had been temporarily disabled, thanks to a small malfunction he had orchestrated. Himself, time was on their side, but they knew that any mistake could cost them. Dearly, Olivia was already in John's room preparing him for the move, though weak. And barely conscious, John seemed to sense that something important was about to happen. His eyes, dulled by illness, moved slowly as he tried to grasp what was going on around him. Margaret entered the room quietly and froze at the sight of her son in such a condition. It had been weeks since she had been able to be close to him, and now standing before him, she couldn't hold back her tears. The man who had once been her pride, strong and determined, now lay in bed as a shadow of his former self. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his body had grown so thin that he seemed fragile, vulnerable. Seeing him like this broke her heart into 1,000 pieces, but it also ignited a strength within her she hadn't known she had. She couldn't let John die in that place. "John, my son," she whispered, approaching the bed and gently stroking his hand. I'm here to get you out of this." John slowly turned his head toward her, and though he couldn't utter a word, Margaret saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. She knew that, deep down, her son was still fighting. Even though his body had been weakened by months of poisoning, Olivia approached delicately. "We need to move him now before Catherine returns," she whispered. "I've arranged for an ambulance. It will take him to a private clinic where he'll be safe." Margaret nodded quickly, wiping away her tears. She knew this wasn't the time to break down together. Olivia and Margaret helped John sit up as gently as possible. His body could barely hold itself up, and every small movement seemed to cause him pain. But there was no alternative. They had to get him out of there before it was too late. Alfred appeared at the door with a wheelchair, and carefully they placed JN in it. The silence in the mansion was absolute, but every little sound, from the creak of the wheels to the rustle of the sheets, seemed to echo loudly through the empty halls. Any noise could alert someone, and they couldn't afford to be discovered. The journey through the mansion's corridors was tense, with every shadow and corner feeling like an imminent threat as they neared the back exit where the ambulance was waiting. Margaret couldn't help but imagine what would happen if Catherine or William returned early. Her heart raced and the sense of urgency grew with each step they took. Finally they reached the back door. The ambulance was there, just as Olivia had promised, with a driver. She had hired someone they could trust to ensure they reached the clinic safely. Carefully they placed John on a stretcher and loaded him into the vehicle. Margaret didn't allow herself to relax until the ambulance doors closed and they began to drive away from the mansion. Olivia sat beside her, closely monitoring John's condition as the vehicle sped toward the clinic. Though they knew the immediate danger had passed, the risk remained high. Catherine and William would soon discover that John was no longer in the house, and when they did, their fury would be unleashed as the ambulance drove away. Margaret looked out the window, watching as the mansion grew smaller in the distance. Part of her felt relieved to see the place that had caused so much harm to her son disappear behind them. But the more rational part of her knew that the real battle was just beginning. Getting John out of the mansion was only the first step. The private clinic they arrived at was small, discreet, and far from the city's hustle. Olivia had carefully chosen the location to ensure that JN could receive medical care without Catherine or William interfering. As soon as they arrived, a medical team, briefed on the situation, took over. Rushing John to a treatment room, Margaret stayed in the wait room, sitting in an uncomfortable plastic chair, while Olivia and the doctors worked inside. She knew they were doing everything they could to save him, but the waiting was unbearable. Every minute that passed without news of her son tore at her insides. After what felt like hours, Olivia emerged from the room, her face showing moderate relief. "John is stable for now," she said in a reassuring tone. "The doctor believes we can reverse some of the damage he suffered, but it will be a long and complicated process. The important thing is that he's in a safe place." Margaret exhaled a breath she had been holding in all day. Though her son was still fighting for his life, the fact that he was out of Catherine and William's control was an immense relief. She knew John wasn't completely out of danger, but at least he had a chance to recover. "What do we do now?" Margaret asked, looking at Olivia with uncertainty in her eyes. "Now we wait for the results of the medication tests," Olivia replied. "If we confirm that John was poisoned, we can take the case to the authorities. The evidence you have on the financial dealings will also be crucial. Catherine and William won't get away with this." Margaret nodded, though she knew that moment was still far off. There was still much to do, and the threat of Catherine loomed large. They wouldn't sit idly by. Once they discovered John had escaped for... Now Margaret allowed herself a brief moment of peace. Her son was safe, even if it was only temporary. And that was more than she had had in weeks. With a weary yet determined face, she sat in the waiting room, knowing that the fight wasn't over. But they had taken an important step toward John's freedom. Silence in the clinic was different from the mansion. Here there were no lurking shadows or dark secrets. Here there was hope. The sun was beginning to set behind the hills as Kathleen and William arrived. At the mansion, the atmosphere in the car was tense. They had just come from an important meeting. But their minds weren't fully focused on business. Catherine had noticed small changes in the house over the past few days. There was something in the air that unsettled her. And while she couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was, she felt that things were no longer under her control as they once had been. As they pulled up to the front entrance, something immediately caught Catherine's attention. The security seemed relaxed. She frowned and quickly got out of the car, walking briskly toward the door. William, ever methodical and cautious, followed with measured steps. The mansion appeared quiet, but the silence that had once felt comforting now seemed eerie. Upon entering, they were greeted by Alfred as usual, his expression neutral. But Catherine noticed something different in his gaze. It was almost imperceptible, but she knew how to read people, and Alfred seemed uncomfortable. Catherine observed him for a second too long, but said nothing. Inside, her distrust was growing rapidly. "Is everything in order, Alfred?" she asked, her voice soft but laced with authority. "Everything is as usual, Mom," the butler replied, avoiding eye contact, which only deepened Catherine's suspicions. However, she decided not to press him for now. Over the years, she had learned to trust her instincts, and those instincts told her that something had changed while she was away. She glanced at William, who, although not sharing her sense of urgency, gave a brief nod as if understanding her thoughts. Without a word, they headed toward the wing where JN had been confined. Meanwhile, at the clinic, Margaret anxiously watched the clerk. Olivia had insisted that she needed to rest after the day's tension, but the mother couldn't stop picturing Catherine and William discovering John's escape. She knew that moment was about to come soon. The mansion's silence would be replaced by a storm of fury. The doctor stepped out of John's room where they had been, stabilizing him. For the past few hours, he approached Margaret and Olivia, who were waiting in the hallway. "Your son is stable for now," the doctor informed them. "His body has responded well to the initial treatment, but he has endured a slow and prolonged poisoning. It will take time for him to fully recover, if he ever does." Margaret swallowed hard, her heart tightening with anxiety. "Will he survive?" she asked, her voice trembling. The doctor paused carefully, choosing his words. "He has a good chance of surviving, but he will need constant care. The damage caused by the poisoning is extensive, and his recovery will be a long and difficult process. What he needs most now is rest and stability." Margaret nodded, relieved that, for the time being, her son was still alive. But she knew that relief was temporary. Outside in the real world, the threat of Catherine and William still loomed, and it was only a matter of time before they began looking for JN. "What about the poison tests?" Olivia asked, breaking Margaret's thoughts. "How much longer until we get the results?" "A few more days," the doctor replied. "What we've found so far confirms our suspicions, but we need a more detailed analysis to present it as formal evidence." A few more days. Margaret felt like those days would stretch into eternity. There was no time to waste. Every second that passed was an opportunity for Catherine to act, and Margaret knew they wouldn't sit idly by. Back at the mansion, Catherine and William reached John's room. Catherine opened the door with her usual cold confidence, expecting to find her husband in the same defenseless, vulnerable state she had left him. But when she stepped inside, her heart stopped. The bed was empty. For a moment, she couldn't process what she was seeing. There was no medical staff, no equipment, no trace of JN. The room was completely empty. The silence that had once dominated the house now became deaf. Her cold expression morphed into one of pure confusion. She slowly turned to William, whose eyes had widened as he realized what John's absence meant. William began frantically searching the room, as if expecting to find a clue that would tell them where John had gone, but everything was in perfect order, with no signs of a struggle or any disturbance. "This can't be happening," Catherine muttered, starting to lose the control she had fought so hard to maintain. How could he be gone? No one could have taken him out of. Without me knowing, she stormed over to Alfred, who had followed at a safe distance. Alfred, who was here while we were gone. Catherine demanded, her tone icy. Alfred, who had been anticipating this moment, kept his gaze lowered. Only the usual staff, mum? No. While outside the household, no one saw him leave. Catherine's calm was beginning to unravel. Her carefully constructed facade of control and power was quickly crumbling. How could he have disappeared without a trace? Alfred hesitated briefly, as if choosing his words carefully. It's possible that someone from the staff may have helped him leave. He left the statement hanging, knowing that pointing fingers directly could put several people, including himself, at risk. Catherine turned to William with a look of pure fury. I knew we should have taken more precautions. I knew we couldn't trust anyone, she hissed, practically spitting the words, but it doesn't matter. We'll find him, and when we do, no one will stand in our way back. At the clinic, the atmosphere was tense. Margaret felt a sense of relief. Knowing her son was safe, she couldn't stop thinking about the storm that was about to break. She knew Catherine and William would stop at nothing to regain control of John and his business. Olivia, noticing her worry, sat down beside her. Know what you're thinking, she said quietly. Catherine will come for him, we know that, but we're closer now to getting what we need to stop her. Margaret nodded, but she couldn't calm the anxiety in her heart. The real battle had only just begun. John has suffered so much. Margaret murmured, I don't know how we got to this point. How did I not see who Catherine really was? Olivia placed a comforting hand over Margaret's. You did everything you could, she said, and now you've done the most important thing. You got John out of that place now. It's time to fight to make sure he never falls into her hands. Again, Margaret knew Olivia was right. Catherine and William might be powerful, but now they had weapons too. The evidence of the poisoning, the documents proving the illegal financial maneuvers. Many questions remained unanswered. But one thing was clear. John was no longer a passive victim. They would fight for him, and this time Catherine and William would face justice. As night fell, and the cool air of the clinic breezed through the windows, Margaret prepared herself mentally for what was to come. It wouldn't be easy, but a mother's love is an unstoppable force. Catherine might have planned her conspiracy carefully, but she had underestimated the power of love, sacrifice, and determination. The battle for John's life and legacy had only just begun. The day began like the calm before the storm. Margaret sat by John's bedside in the clinic, watching him breathe softly. The steady beep of the heart monitor was the only consistent sign that life still fought within his weakened body. Beside her, Olivia carefully checked John's vitals, ensuring everything was in order. The doctors had stabilized him, but they knew his recovery would be slow, and the damage caused by the poisoning had left deep scars. Still, the mere fact that John was safe and beginning to improve was a small victory, a glimmer of hope amidst the darkness. But Margaret knew the peace she felt in that moment was only temporary. Catherine wouldn't give up easily, and at any moment her fury would come crashing down on them. The clock ticked slowly, each tick a reminder that the final showdown was approaching. Only one thing remained to set their plan in motion: the definitive proof that John had been poisoned. Suddenly, Olivia rushed into the room, her face filled with urgency. The tests are in, she announced, unable to hide the nervousness in her voice. The results confirm what we suspected. John has been receiving progressively higher doses of poison in his treatment for months. Margaret felt a wave of mixed emotions: relief, because they now had the proof they needed to bring Catherine to justice, and horror, because that proof confirmed the cruelty of the woman who had betrayed her son. Catherine hadn't just tried to destroy him physically and emotionally. She had done it with cold, methodical cruelty, poisoning him slowly to strip him of everything he had built. What do we do now? Margaret asked, trying to keep calm. As her mind faded through the possibilities, Olivia, always pragmatic, responded quickly with the medical evidence and the financial documents. We can file a formal complaint, but we have to move fast. Catherine will soon find out about the clinic, or worse, use her influence to stop us before we reach the authorities. Margaret nodded, fully aware of the gravity of the situation. They couldn't afford any mistakes with the evidence in hand. The next step was to confront Catherine and William in their own game, but this time with the law on their side. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, Catherine was losing control, the staff terrified. of her temper moved quickly to avoid getting caught in her path. The news of John's disappearance had unhinged her. It wasn't just the loss of control over him that enraged her, but the fear of what might happen if someone discovered what she had really been doing, if John recovered, if the evidence of the poisoning came to light. Her entire life, her fortune and her reputation would be in jeopardy. This can't be happening, she muttered as she paced frantically in William's office. We had everything under control. William, calmer but equally concerned, sat behind his desk reviewing the contracts and financial transactions they had manipulated over the past months. He didn't just disappear, William said without looking up. If John is receiving medical treatment, it's only a matter of time before the poisoning. Evidence is uncovered and then we're finished. Catherine glared at him, furious at his calm demeanor. Then we need to stop it, she shouted, her eyes blazing with anger. We can't let it get to that point, not now. And how do you suggest we do that? William asked coldly. We can't just storm into the clinic and take him back. It's too late for that. Catherine knew her brother was right, but that didn't lessen her desperation. She knew Margaret and Olivia were behind this, and the thought of her perfect plan unraveling before her eyes filled her with rage. There are other ways to control the situation, William said, finally looking up from his papers. If we can get the authorities on our side before they present the evidence, we could discredit them. We need to make it look like this is a personal attack by Margaret to regain control of JK's business. Catherine smiled, understanding her brother's plan. Yes, we can make it look like a setup, discredit Margaret, make her seem desperate. After all, who would trust a mother desperate to blame her daughter-in-law for an accident? Both of them knew that, while it wasn't a long-term strategy, it could buy them enough time to prevent the evidence from reaching the authorities and somehow change the narrative. Hours later at the clinic, Margaret and Olivia were preparing to take the evidence directly to the authorities. They knew they couldn't wait any longer. Olivia had contacted a trusted lawyer who was familiar with the case and would accompany them to present the medical tests and financial documents. Everything was ready just as they were about to leave. Olivia's phone rang. The lawyer's voice on the other end was tense. There's a problem, he said. Catherine and William have filed a complaint against you. They're claiming that John was kidnapped by his mother and that this is all part of a scheme to take control of his business. Margaret felt the ground fall out from beneath her. How is that possible? She asked, her voice cracking with indignation. JN is fighting for his life, I know, the lawyer replied, but it seems they're pulling string things behind the scenes. They're trying to discredit you before you can present the evidence. You need to act now, Margaret turned to Olivia, knowing that the legal battle they were about to face would be even tougher than they had anticipated. But she also knew they couldn't stop now. John's life and well-being were at stake, and she couldn't let Catherine win this time. Let's go, Margaret said with renewed determination. We're going to fight with everything we've got in court. The legal battle began with intensity. Seether, as always, presented herself with elegance, portraying the image of a concerned wife claiming that Margaret and Olivia had kidnapped John to keep him from receiving medical care and take control of his fortune. However, when Margaret presented the evidence of the poisoning along with the financial documents proving the manipulation of John's business, the courtroom fell into stunned silence. Catherine tried to maintain her composure, but as the lawyers and witnesses laid out the evidence of her betrayal, her face began to crumble. The judge, after reviewing the evidence, quickly understood what had really happened. John had not been kidnapped. He had been rescued from a wife who had tried to slowly kill him to seize his fortune. Catherine and William, the judge declared, are guilty of attempted murder and financial fraud. The sentence struck Catherine and William like a death blow. Catherine, who had manipulated everything around her for years, watched as her empire crumbled. Within minutes, security officers escorted her out of the courtroom as Margaret, relieved but exhausted, collapsed into a chair, feeling that justice had finally prevailed. The days following the trial were a mix of relief and reflection for Margaret. After Catherine and William's sentencing, life slowly returned to a more peaceful rhythm. Though the healing process for both JN and Margaret would take time, the warm summer breeze swept gently across the countryside, where Margaret had spent most of her life and now found herself once again alongside Her son, who was slowly recovering in the serenity of the family home, Johan had been moved from the clinic to a small, rented cottage near Margaret's home, where he received constant medical care far from the painful memories of the mansion. Although his health was still fragile, he had shown clear signs of improvement over the past few weeks. His strength was gradually returning, and while the road ahead was long, he was alive, out of danger, and surrounded by his mother's love. Margaret sat on the porch of the little house, gazing at the horizon as the sun slowly set. The sky was painted with warm colors, and the sound of birds filled the air. So much had happened in recent months that at times it was hard to believe it was all over, she recalled. Every moment of anguish, every tear shared at her son's bedside. And now here she was with John safe and Catherine and William facing the consequences of their actions. Olivia arrived shortly after. Smiling with her familiar mix of exhaustion and satisfaction, she had chosen to continue. As John's nurse during his recovery and over time had become a close friend to Margaret, they had shared a journey of struggle and sacrifice, and the bond they had forged was something that wouldn't be easily broken. I saw him looking a bit better today, Olivia said as she sat next to Margaret. He's regaining mobility in his legs, and the doctors think he'll start walking again soon, though it will be a slow process. Margaret smiled. Any small improvement was an immense gift to her. Thank you, Olivia. I don't know how I would have done all this without you, she said, her voice filled with gratitude. Olivia returned the smile, but there was something deeper in her eyes. It wasn't just for John that I did it. You've been incredible, Margaret. Your love and determination saved your son. You were the one who never gave up, even when everything seemed lost. Margaret gazed at the horizon, letting Olivia's words sink in. She didn't see herself as a heroine, but she knew she had fought with everything she had. Deep down, it was a mother's love that had driven her, giving her the strength to face Catherine. Despite all the obstacles later, Margaret went inside and walked directly to John's room. He was sitting in bed, propped up by pillows, his eyes closed, but when he sensed his mother's presence, he opened them slowly and smiled. "Mama," he murmured, his voice soft but clear. Margaret approached and sat next to him, taking his hand in hers. The warmth of his touch reassured her, a constant reminder that her son was still with her. "You're getting better every day, my dear," she said tenderly. "Soon you'll be running through the fields again, just like when you were a boy." John let out a small laugh, though it was clear it took effort. "Maybe I won't run as fast as before, but I hope to be on my feet soon." They sat in silence for a while, simply enjoying each other's company. Words weren't as necessary now as they once were. Being together after all they had been through was enough. "I want you to know something, Mom," John said suddenly, his voice growing firmer through it all. "Even when I couldn't speak or move, I felt you. I knew you were close. Even when I was in that mansion, I knew you hadn't abandoned me. That gave me the strength to keep fighting, even when it seemed like everything was lost." Tears filled Margaret's eyes. She squeezed his hand harder, trying to hold back the emotions flooding her heart. "I'll always be with you, John," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. Always. As the days passed, life found a new balance. JN gradually regained more mobility thanks to physical therapy sessions and the constant support of Olivia and the doctors. The process wasn't easy, but every small step was a victory, not just for him, but also for Margaret, who watched her son return to the strong and determined man she had always known. Meanwhile, Catherine and William were sentenced to prison for their crimes. The trial had been a catharsis for Margaret, who, though filled with pain for what her son had endured, finally saw justice prevail. The empire Catherine had tried to build through lies and betrayal collapsed, and though the damage done to John could never be fully erased, at least now he was safe in time. Margaret decided to return to her home in the countryside, the place that had always been her refuge, while John remained nearby, continuing his recovery in the small cottage. The bond between mother and son had only grown stronger through everything they had endured, and they both knew that though the path had been difficult, the most important thing was that they had walked it together. Months later, on a quiet, Margaret and John decided to take a walk through the nearby fields. Although John still needed support to walk long distances, he felt stronger every day. The clear blue sky stretched above them. As they walked slowly, recalling the days when John had been just a boy running freely through those same fields. "This place gives me peace," John said as he looked at the landscape. "It's like everything we've been through fades away when I'm here," Margaret smiled, feeling the same sense of relief. "This will always be your home, son, no matter how far you go. This will always be your refuge." John looked at her and smiled. He knew that no matter what the future held, he would always have his mother by his side. That was his true wealth, something neither Catherine nor William could ever take away from him. As the sun began to set on the horizon, mother and son continued their walk together with the promise of a future filled with peace. After having faced and conquered the darkness, life had changed, but the love and strength they shared would bind them forever. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey, filled with emotion and suspense. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next episodes filled with more drama and unexpected twists. See you in the next chapter, where love and justice always prevail. Until next time. The closing words of the story echoed in the stillness, offering a sense of conclusion, yet hinting at the possibilities of what lay ahead. As Margaret and John walked into the distance, the golden light of the setting sun seemed to wrap around them like a protective embrace. The peaceful countryside stretched on, a quiet testament to their resilience and strength. Margaret had given everything for her son, her love, her determination, her unwavering belief that justice would prevail. And in the end, it had. John had been freed from the manipulative claws of Catherine and William, and with every step he took toward recovery, Margaret knew that their journey was one of healing and new beginnings. John, in turn, had rediscovered his strength and his purpose. He had learned through unimaginable trials that the greatest wealth one could possess was not in fortune or power, but in the love and support of those who truly cared. As the screen faded to black, the promise of a new chapter lingered in the air, one where mother and son would continue to face the world, side by side, stronger than ever before.